YN's life had spiraled further into darkness. What little hope she had left seemed to vanish with each passing day. She was still living in the shabby, broken-down house with the old woman. Her life had become a cycle of survival, scraping by with whatever she could manage. After selling most of her belongings, keeping only 3 sets of clothes, she used the money to buy food for herself and the old woman. But even that ran out quickly, leaving her with nothing but despair. YN tried, she really tried. She searched for work tirelessly, applying for jobs as a waitress, janitor, or cleaner. But each rejection chipped away at her self-worth. With only a high school education and no connections, finding a job in a company was out of the question. Eventually, she stopped trying, her spirit broken. She took to sitting on the footpath, as she once had, watching the world pass her by. Strangers occasionally dropped a few coins into her lap or handed her their leftover food. It was how she survived, but it wasn't living. It was merely existing. And with every passing day, YN's resentment for Taehyung grew. He had destroyed her life, stripped her of everything she once held dear, and left her in this pit of loneliness and misery. 3 months after that, the old woman's health began to fail rapidly. She became so weak that she couldn't even stand on her own. YN did everything she could to care for her, begging on the streets during the day and nursing the woman at night. For 2 long, agonizing months, YN watched her only companion fade away, until finally, a month ago, the old woman passed away. Now, YN was truly alone. She sat on the footpath, feeling more isolated than ever. She had no one to talk to, no one to listen to her. The one person who had shown her kindness, even in the bleakest of times, was gone. And with her gone, YN had lost the only semblance of comfort she had. At least, with the old woman, she had been able to share her feelings, to express her pain. Now, all that was left was silence. Still, YN had one thing: shelter. The rundown house, with its cracked walls and leaking roof, was all she had to protect herself from the harsh world outside. And for that, she was grateful, though her heart ached every single day. She sat there, head bowed, wondering how much longer she could keep going in this endless cycle of despair, feeling the weight of her loneliness and abandonment pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. It was a rainy morning, the streets were slick with puddles of dirty water. YN, already deep in her misery, was sitting on the footpath when a car sped by, splashing dirty rainwater all over her. The cold, filthy water soaked her clothes, and it was the final straw for her. YN, her anger boiling over, stood up and cursed loudly at the driver. YN, furious, a fucking bastard. It's not your father's road. Surprisingly, the car came to a screeching halt a little further down the road. It reversed, stopping right in front of her, causing YN's heart to pound in fear. She wasn't prepared for a confrontation. YN froze in shock, her eyes widening in disbelief as the man approached. It was KIMTAEHYUNG, the man she hadn't seen since their short-lived marriage. The villain of her story, the one who had turned her life upside down, was standing right in front of her. Taehyung stared at her, equally shocked at finding her in such a state. His voice was calm, but there was confusion in his tone. Taehyung, what are you doing here? YN scoffed bitterly, the audacity of him to ask that question enraged her even more. YN, with a scoff, where should I be? Taehyung raised an eyebrow, genuinely perplexed. Taehyung, did he leave you? YN, still seething, narrowed her eyes. YN, who exactly? Taehyung's expression remained composed, as if he already knew the answer. Taehyung, your boyfriend. YN laughed bitterly, the disbelief clear in her voice. How could he still be so clueless? YN, mocking him, my husband divorced me on the 8th day of our marriage because he was an asshole. That sentence hit Taehyung like a slap to the face. His confident demeanor faltered for a moment, and he looked genuinely stunned. Taehyung, confused, frowning, what are you talking about? It's you who ran away with your lover after a week I left. YN couldn't believe what she was hearing. Rage and disbelief coursed through her veins as she stared at him in shock. YN, furious, what the actual foo *k? Okay, so to avoid any misunderstanding for dear armies, I will clarify it from the start. So in case of any confusion, ask me in the comment section, but don't jump to conclusion fast. KIMTAEHYUNG, a 28-year-old man, was known for his maturity and sense of responsibility. He was the eldest son in the Kim family, which consisted of his mother, Mrs. Kim, his younger sister Jiha, and his youngest brother, Suho. Their father, Mr. Kim, had passed away 6 years ago, leaving Taehyung to shoulder many of the family's burdens. Unlike her late husband, Mrs. Kim didn't seem to value Taehyung as more than just a provider. She showered Jiha and Suho with affection while viewing Taehyung merely as the family's breadwinner. The Kim family lived a comfortable, upper-middle-class life, but they were far from being rich. Mr. Kim, before his death, had always appreciated Taehyung's responsible nature. He knew Taehyung was destined to achieve great things. And indeed, Taehyung had fulfilled that potential. Living in New York, far away from his family in Busan, he worked as a software developer for a well-established tech company. With his skills and dedication, Taehyung had climbed the ranks to a high-paying position, which afforded him a flat, a car, and a comfortable lifestyle. Despite his success, Taehyung never forgot his family. Every month, without fail, he sent a substantial sum of money back to Busan. It was his way of showing love and support, even if the only time he heard from his mother or siblings was when they needed more money or had some issue they expected him to solve. It had become such a routine that Taehyung no longer questioned it. His heart, though quietly yearning for the kind of love and care that his mother gave Jiha and Suho, accepted his role. He wanted to believe that his mother still cared for him, if only in her own way. One day, as he was sitting in his apartment after a long day of work, his phone rang. It was his mother, Mrs. Kim. He quickly answered, his heart beating a little faster with the hope that perhaps, this time, the conversation would be different. Mrs. Kim, Taehyung. Now that you're turning 29 soon, you should think about getting married. Taehyung was caught off guard. Marriage? It wasn't something he'd really thought about, at least not seriously. His life in New York was busy, and the idea of settling down had always seemed distant. But hearing this from his mother, there was a strange sense of warmth. Maybe, just maybe, she was thinking about his future, about him as a person, not just as someone who sent money home. Taehyung, I will, Mom, he replied softly, a small smile forming on his lips. Mrs. Kim, well, I've already found a girl for you. She's very sweet and nice. The words caught him off guard again, but this time his surprise was mixed with a touch of amusement. His mother had already chosen someone for him? He hadn't expected that, but he wasn't opposed to the idea. If his mother approved of the girl, maybe she truly was someone who could make him happy. Taehyung, if you like her, then okay. I don't have any problem. His response was simple, but inside, his heart swelled a little. Was this her way of showing she cared about his happiness? The thought made him feel lighter. Mrs. Kim, I knew it. You should come back home soon. His smile widened. His mother actually wanted him to return home. The last time he'd visited Busan had been a while ago, and usually, his returns were tied to family emergencies or financial matters. This time, though, it was for something personal. For him. Taehyung, okay. I'll ask for leave from my CEO. Mrs. Kim, good, then I'll start preparing for your wedding, okay? Taehyung laughed softly. His mother sounded so enthusiastic about the whole thing. It felt nice. Maybe things were changing. Maybe she was starting to see him as more than just a provider. Taehyung, yes, Mom. As the call ended, Taehyung leaned back in his chair, smiling to himself. For the first time in a long while, he felt connected to his mother, like she genuinely cared about his future. He couldn't help but think about how long it had been since she had shown this kind of interest in him. It warmed his heart, even if only for a moment. But as the initial joy of the conversation settled, a thought crept into his mind. Why now? Why, after all these years of distant conversations about money and responsibilities, had she suddenly decided it was time for him to marry? It seemed too abrupt. He frowned, the seed of doubt taking root in his thoughts. As he stood up and prepared to go to bed, Taehyung let himself smile once more. Whatever her reasons, his mother was thinking about him. That, for now, was enough. Taehyung stepped off the plane, the familiar atmosphere of Seoul filling his senses, but there was a dull ache in his heart. He hadn't been home in a long time. He called for a cab, not surprised that no one came to pick him up. It had always been like that. He was the one who made the efforts, the one who returned, and they were always busy. But still, it was home. Arriving at the house, Taehyung greeted his mother and the maid. The house felt strangely empty without his siblings around, but he had grown used to their absence in more ways than one. "Mrs. Kim, it's a shame you only got 10 days off." "Taehyung, actually, we just got a new project at work. We need to start on it within 2 weeks, so I couldn't get more time." "Mrs. Kim, thank God they gave you leave, at least. Otherwise, what would I have told YN's family?" she said, her tone laced with fake concern. Taehyung blinked. YN? The name caught him off guard. He knew about the arranged marriage, but he hadn't really thought much about it until now. "Taehyung, YN? Mrs. Kim, your soon-to-be wife," she replied, almost offhandedly, as if the conversation wasn't life-changing for him. Taehyung, oh. It was all he could say. The reality of the situation slowly settling in. "Mrs. Kim, anyways, the wedding is the day after tomorrow, so make sure you prepare." Taehyung nodded, offering her a small, polite smile. His heart felt heavy, but he kept his thoughts to himself. This was his reality now, marrying a woman he'd never met, for the sake of his mother's plans. Taehyung stood tall in his groom's attire, his eyes fixed on his bride. YN, dressed in a stunning white wedding gown, looked every bit the picture of beauty, yet something felt wrong. Her expression wasn't one of joy, instead, she appeared nervous, almost scared. The air between them was tense, and he couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at his heart. Taehyung's mind raced with questions. "Why aren't you smiling?" he wondered, staring at her as she avoided his gaze. "Were you forced into this? Do you like someone else?" His thoughts were a whirlwind, his heart sinking with each question. "Or maybe you just need time." Deciding on the last possibility, Taehyung took a deep breath and kept his thoughts to himself. Respect was paramount to him, and he wasn't going to push her into something she wasn't ready for. After all, they had barely spoken before the wedding, it had all happened so fast. He convinced himself that with time, they would grow closer. For now, he would give her space. Day 1 of marriage. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. YN had unpacked her things, and Taehyung respected her space, giving her time to settle in. He had hoped they'd share a conversation, but when he tried to speak, she responded with short, polite answers. There was no warmth between them, no comfort, just silence. Taehyung watched her carefully. She avoided eye contact, moved quietly around the house, and didn't seem to want to engage in conversation. He wondered if she was still adjusting, and again, he told himself to be patient. Day 2 of marriage. Breakfast was awkward. Taehyung tried again to break the silence, asking simple questions about her day or if she wanted to go out and explore the city. YN merely shook her head, giving him a soft no, and retreating to her room. Her behavior felt strange to him, but he didn't want to pry. Maybe she wasn't used to this kind of arrangement, and pushing her to talk could make things worse. By the evening, the house felt colder. Taehyung found himself staring at the walls, wondering why the gap between them seemed so wide. He wanted to understand her but wasn't sure how. Day 3 of marriage. Taehyung woke up early, hoping to have breakfast together, but when he went to the kitchen, YN was already done. She had prepared food but had eaten alone. It stung a little, but he pushed down the feeling and decided to give her even more space. Throughout the day, Taehyung saw her pacing in the garden. Her face was filled with unease, and every time he tried to approach her, she made an excuse to leave the room. He started wondering if something bigger was troubling her. He wanted to ask her, "Is everything all right?" But the words stayed stuck in his throat. His respect for her privacy kept him from pushing further. Day 4 of marriage. Silence dominated the house again. Taehyung had grown used to the quiet, though it weighed on him heavily. He noticed little things, how YN flinched when he came too close, how she avoided even the smallest touches. There was a strange tension in the air, one he couldn't place. He had thought marriage would be different, that they'd share laughs, talk about life, but instead, it felt like they were strangers living under the same roof. Still, he said nothing. Day 5 of marriage. Taehyung caught glimpses of YN late at night, sitting by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked lost, distant, and it tugged at his heart. He wanted to comfort her, to ask what was going on inside her mind, but every time he approached her, she'd retreat. The only conversation they had that day was about groceries. It was brief, awkward, and left a bitter taste in his mouth. He wondered if this was what marriage was supposed to feel like, this emptiness, this distance. Day 6 of marriage. The tension between them had grown thicker. Taehyung was starting to feel it pressing down on him. His patience, which had been endless, was starting to wane. He had done his best to give her space, to respect her boundaries, but now he wondered if it had been the right choice. YN barely spoke, her eyes filled with something he couldn't read. Fear? Sadness? Guilt? He had no idea. The walls between them were impenetrable, and for the first time, Taehyung felt like he was losing hope. Day 7 of marriage. The silence was unbearable. Taehyung packed his suitcase quietly, not wanting to disturb her. He had to leave for work to New York, but it felt more like an escape. Maybe, he thought, some time apart would help. Maybe when he returned, they could start fresh. YN stood by the doorway, watching him. For the first time in days, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Taehyung looked at her one last time before stepping out. Taehyung, softly, take care. He had hoped for some response, even a small one, but all he got was a silent nod. As he closed the door behind him and headed for the airport, Taehyung couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He just didn't know what. That was the last time he saw her before everything fell apart. Taehyung sat in his office, the city of New York alive with activity outside the window, yet inside, he was drowning in his thoughts. It had been over a week since the wedding, and work had consumed him entirely. He had barely thought about reaching out to his new wife, caught up in the frenzy of his new project. But now, a moment of quiet made him pause. Should I call her? He thought, pulling out his phone. As he scrolled through his contacts, he realized something odd, he didn't even have her number. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Why didn't I ask for it before? His mind flashed back to the 7 days they spent together. He had never seen her with a phone, not once. Why didn't she ever use it? The thought bothered him for a moment, but he brushed it aside. Dialing his mother, he greeted her briefly, then asked about YN. Mrs. Kim, casually, oh, she went to meet some friend today. Meet a friend? Taehyung thought but didn't dwell on it too much. Maybe she was just out, trying to adjust. After hanging up, he decided he would call her later. Work was pressing, and he was already behind. 2 days later. Taehyung was drowning in meetings, paperwork, and endless calls. But during a rare break, he texted his sister, Jihoo, checking in on YN. Jihoo, text she's sleeping. That was the only response he got, and though it felt odd, he shrugged it off. Maybe she's still adjusting to everything. 4 days later in LA. The last few days had been a blur. Taehyung and his boss had traveled to LA for work, leaving him exhausted and overwhelmed. Finally back in New York, he felt the need to check in again. This time, he called his mother, expecting the usual small talk. But what he heard was anything but usual. Mrs. Kim, in a shaky voice, your wife, she ran away with her boyfriend. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Taehyung, shocked, what? He couldn't process it. His brain scrambled to make sense of what his mother had just said. Mrs. Kim, continuing, yes, she was in a relationship before the marriage. I didn't know. Her parents must have forced her into this. They even took her phone, but somehow, she managed to contact him. She left a letter saying she loves him and that we shouldn't try to find her. There was a pause as his mother's voice trembled, a hint of fake sobbing slipping through. Mrs. Kim adding with fake tears, she even took all the jewelry. Not just hers, but mine and Jiho's as well. I'm so sorry, Taehyung. Taehyung sat frozen. The words hit him one after another, each more unbelievable than the last. He didn't know what to feel. Anger, hurt, confusion, it all swirled inside him, but he couldn't settle on any one emotion. All he knew was that something inside him hurt. Taehyung, calmly. I'll call later. He hung up the phone, not wanting to hear anything more. Silence filled the room as he stared at the pendant he had bought for YN during his LA trip. It was a small, delicate piece of jewelry he had picked out especially for her, thinking about how she might smile when she saw it. Now, the sight of it only deepened the pain in his chest. Taehyung, bitterly to himself, now your behavior makes sense to me, wow. Everything from the wedding day, the awkward silence, the distant looks, it all started to click into place, like pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve. YN's cold demeanor, her avoidance. The way she had distanced herself from him, it wasn't because she needed time or because she was nervous about the marriage. She had been thinking about someone else the entire time. She didn't even want to be with me, he thought, his hands gripping the edges of his desk. He had tried to understand her, to give her space, to respect her boundaries, but in the end, it all felt like a joke. Somewhere deep inside, Taehyung felt something breaking. He had started to like her, slowly but surely, and now it all felt pointless. Coming back to the present, YN was shocked hearing the story cooked up by her dear ex-in-laws. YN, well, you should hear my side too. She tells him her part. Taehyung, then why were you so distant? YN, you were a stranger, a simple stranger. What did you expect? That I'd hug you? Kiss you? Or cling to you? Taehyung grabbed YN's hand. Taehyung, come with me. YN, where? But he didn't answer, or pretended not to hear. Taehyung drove the car to his house, his mind filled with questions. YN, where are we going? Taehyung, somewhere we never belonged. YN, huh? The car stopped in front of the house YN had left in tears. Grabbing YN's hand, Taehyung took her inside. Even YN now wanted to know the truth. Mrs. Kim, Suho, and Jiho were sitting in the living room, laughing and choosing dresses. Oh, by the way, Taehyung had returned from New York for Jiho's wedding. The trio was shocked when they saw YN. Mrs. Kim, Tae. Why is she here like this? Taehyung, exactly, Mom. Why is she like this? Mrs. Kim, listen, Tae, whatever she said was a lie. She's just Taehyung, how many lies, Mom? Mrs. Kim, I am not lying, Taehyung. She's lying. We never gave her any letter or anything. She made all of this up. We never made you sign any divorce papers. She's just making it all up, my son. Taehyung, how do you know? Mrs. Kim, huh? Taehyung, I never mentioned what she said. How do you know about the letter and the divorce papers? Mrs. Kim gulped. Mrs. Kim. That. I. Jiho, she ran away with her boyfriend. Suho, brother. She even used to flirt with my friends. Mrs. Kim. Yeah. YN, shut up. Don't you remember how to die? How can you lie to my face like this? You're staining my character. Mrs. Kim, Taehyung, Taehyung, enough, Mom. You all have no shame. What didn't I do for you guys, huh? I lived abroad, working day and night so that you all could live comfortably here. And you stained my wife's character. Why, Mom? Why? Am I not your son? His eyes teary. Why can't you love me like you love Jiho and Suho? Mrs. Kim, no, Tae, I love you. Taehyung, is that why you did all this to my wife? Why did you marry us in the first place? Why did you ruin her life? What was her fault, Mom? Jiho, Appa. She fed you lies. Taehyung gave her a look that said don't you dare. He grabbed YN's hand and took her to his room. He started packing his things. He picked out a dress, a girly one, and gave it to YN. YN looked at him, shocked. Taehyung, I bought this for you when I went to LA. I thought of giving it to Jihoo, but it was always yours. Now, go change. YN took the dress and went to change. She took a shower too. When she came out, Taehyung had packed everything. He grabbed his luggage and took YN's hand to leave. They tried to stop him, but he didn't listen. He left with her. They tried to stop him, but he didn't listen. He left with her. While Jihoo screamed at her mother, obviously, who was going to pay for her wedding now, they started calling Taehyung, but he never picked up. Taehyung's hands were gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white from the tension. His mind raced with everything that had just unfolded at his parents' house. The lies, the deceit, it was all too much. The weight of betrayal sat heavy on his chest, but even heavier was the realization of what they had done to YN, his wife. In the silence of the car, YN's voice finally broke through, soft but firm. YN, you should drop me somewhere around here. Her words were cold, distant. Taehyung, without looking at her, where? YN, with a sigh, anywhere. Taehyung's jaw clenched, and he took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. He pulled over to the side of the road, but instead of letting her out, he turned to her, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. Taehyung, and where will you go? What's your plan after this, YN? You think you can just disappear? YN, with a bitter laugh, I'm not your wife anymore, Taehyung. We signed divorce papers, remember? Taehyung's eyes softened as he looked at her, hurt evident in his gaze. Taehyung, calmly, but with pain, are you really that clueless? Which court in this world grants a divorce just 7 days after a wedding? Do you really think it was that easy? He watched her reaction, her eyes widening in shock as the truth started to settle in. Taehyung, with a sad chuckle of those papers, they were fake, YN. My signature, also fake. I never signed them. You never stopped being my wife. His voice cracked, the weight of the past few weeks catching up with him, his vulnerability laid bare in front of her. YN, in disbelief, what are you saying? Her voice was barely a whisper, her mind reeling from everything he just revealed. Taehyung, softly, you're still Mrs. KIMTAEHYUNG. The car fell silent again, the hum of the city around them fading into the background. Taehyung ran a hand through his hair, his heart heavy. He looked at her, eyes glassy, filled with emotion he could no longer hold back. Taehyung, voice trembling, I respected you from day one, YN. I didn't push, didn't ask for more than you could give. I thought maybe, you just needed time. I tried to understand the distance, your silence, but I always believed there was something more behind it. And now I know, my family made it impossible for you to be yourself. They lied to both of us. YN looked away, tears welling up in her eyes, unsure of what to say. She had been hurt, confused, lost in her own fears, but now she realized Taehyung had been hurt too, manipulated in ways he didn't even see. Taehyung, with a broken voice, I never wanted to be just a stranger to you. I wanted you to feel safe, to feel like you could trust me. But instead, they fed you lies, and I didn't do enough to stop them. I wasn't there when you needed me. His voice was barely above a whisper now, his pain evident in every word. He had always been strong, composed, but in front of her, he was crumbling. Taehyung, with teary eyes, I left because I thought you needed space, not because I didn't care. And when I found out you were gone, I thought maybe you hated me. That I wasn't enough for you. But now I see, they ruined everything between us before we even had a chance. YN's heart clenched as she listened to him, the depth of his pain becoming clearer with each word. She hadn't realized how much he had struggled, how much he had cared. Taehyung, choking up, all I wanted was to make this work, and now, it feels like I've lost everything. But I'm not letting them tear us apart anymore, YN. I won't let them win. Not this time. YN looked at him, tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't know what the future held, but But for the first time, she saw him not as a stranger, but as someone who had fought silently for her. YN, in a quiet voice, I don't know what to say. Taehyung, gently, you don't have to say anything right now. Just, don't walk away from us. Not yet. And for the first time since their marriage, YN didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she held on, her heart still heavy, but something inside her softening at the sight of the man sitting beside her, who had been through so much for her, without her even knowing.